Hey guys, tonight we were going to walk alongside a woman who saw it all. Imagine the dust of a Galilean road under your sandals, the sun beating down, the scent of olive groves, and distant cooking fires in the air. You're part of a crowd, a movement, following a man who speaks of kingdoms and mustard seeds. Now, imagine being there for the highest highs, and a low so devastating it felt like the sun had been extinguished forever. Then, imagine being the very first person to see the dawn that followed. Let's be real, witnessing the full spectrum of that story, from triumphant entry to brutal execution to world-altering mystery. You probably won't survive this with your heart entirely intact. It's a story that asks for a piece of you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you down in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The story of a person doesn't begin with the most famous thing they ever did. It doesn't start with the moment the history books choose to press record. It begins in the quiet, unseen, unremembered moments. It begins with the air they breathed, the ground they walked on, the sounds that filled their mornings, and the worries that haunted their nights. So, to understand Mary of Magdala, the woman who would stand at the epicenter of a world-changing event, we can't just jump to the end. We have to go back. We have to go to the place that gave her a name, Magdala. Let's try and picture it. Forget the dusty, silent ruins you might see on a tour today. Imagine a town teeming, thrumming with life, perched on the western shore of a body of water so central to the life of the region that they simply called it the sea. The Sea of Galilee. It's not a sea, really, more of a freshwater lake, a great big harp-shaped jewel set into the hills of Galilee. And the sun, the Galilean sun, is a character in itself. In the morning, it spills over the Golan Heights to the east, turning the water from inky blue to a shimmering sheet of silver and gold. It bakes the volcanic rock of the hills, warms the limestone of the houses, and draws the scent out of everything. And in Magdala, the dominant scent is fish. It's an aroma that's more than just a smell. It's the town's identity. It's in the air, in the soil, in the clothes of every person who lives there. It's the sharp, salty tang of the fresh catch being hauled ashore in the pre-dawn cool. The frantic energy of the morning market where fishermen, their hands and arms scarred with the memory of nets and hooks, shout their prices. But it's also a deeper, more pervasive smell. It's the heavy, pungent odor of the processing houses. For Magdala isn't just a fishing village, it's an industry. Its Greek name, Tarakia, literally means the place of salting fish. This is the place the bounty of the sea is transformed into a product that will travel for hundreds of miles. Walk through the town in your mind. The streets are narrow, unpaved, a mixture of packed earth and stones. Chickens and goats wander freely. You'd hear a constant symphony of noise, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of wooden mallets breaking up blocks of salt from the Dead Sea, hauled in by caravan. The sloshing of water in great vats where fish are brined. The sizzle and pop from the smokehouses, where rows of split fish hang like laundry, slowly turning a rich, golden brown over smoldering olive wood. The air is thick with this smoke, mingling with the salt and the dust, and the scent of baking bread from 100 small clay ovens. It's a busy, prosperous place. This isn't some forgotten backwater. Magdala is on the map. It sits astride one of the great arteries of the ancient world, the Via Maris, the Way of the Sea. This is the superhighway of its day, linking the ancient power of Egypt with the sprawling empires of Mesopotamia. Legions have marched this road. Merchants with caravans of spices from the east, silks from farther still, have led their complaining camels along its path. Tax collectors, officials, messengers, scholars, and scoundrels, they all pass through or near Magdala. This constant flow of traffic makes the town a cosmopolitan hub. You'd hear not just the local Aramaic, the language of Jesus and his disciples, but also the common Greek of the wider empire, and the clipped, authoritative Latin of the Roman soldiers who might be seen patrolling the market, their armor glinting in the sun, a constant reminder of who was really in charge. This prosperity is, of course, a double-edged sword. It brings wealth, but it also brings oversight. It brings new ideas, but it also brings new temptations and new masters. The town has its fine houses, perhaps belonging to the owners of the fishing fleets or the export businesses. Houses with cool interior courtyards, maybe even a mosaic floor depicting a boat on the sea. But for every one of those, there are a dozen simple, 1 or 2 room stone or mud brick homes where entire families live and work, where life is a daily grind, a struggle to have enough, to pay the taxes, to stay on the right side of the powerful. Into this world, this noisy, smelly, bustling, complicated world, Mary is born. The Bible gives her a name and a place, Mary of Magdala. It seems simple, but it tells us something important. In a time when women were often known only by their relationship to a man, as the wife of so-and-so, or the daughter of so-and-so, she is identified by her hometown. This could suggest she was a woman of some standing, perhaps an independent woman, maybe a widow who controlled her own affairs, or the head of a household. It suggests she was a known figure in this town, a personality, not just one of the crowd. We don't know about her family. We can imagine, though. Perhaps her father owned a boat, or a small share in one. Maybe she spent her childhood mending nets with her mother and sisters, their fingers nimble and quick, a skill as essential as knowing how to bake bread. Or perhaps her family was in the other great Magdalene industry, textiles. The town was also known for its fine dyed wool. Maybe she grew up around the vats of dye, the brilliant colors of indigo and crimson, her hands permanently stained by the vibrant work. Whatever her background, she would have been steeped in the rhythms of Jewish life. The weekly observance of the Sabbath, when the noise of the town would fall to a reverent hush. The annual pilgrimages to Jerusalem for the great festivals, the roads crowded with families traveling together, singing the psalms of ascent as they neared the holy city. She would know the stories of Abraham, Moses, and David, as well as she knew the shoreline of her sea. But Galilee in the time of Mary is a land of tension. It's a pot simmering just below the boiling point. The ruler is a man named Herod Antipas, one of the sons of the infamous Herod the Great. Antipas is a tetrarch, a sort of quarter king, ruling this region as a client of the Roman Empire. He's a cunning, politically savvy operator, a survivor. He builds lavish cities, like the new capital of Tiberias, just down the coast from Magdala, a city built in honor of the Roman emperor, a place many devout Jews considered unclean and avoided. Antipas is a Jew by heritage, but he lives and rules like a Hellenistic king, caught between the demands of his Roman patrons and the simmering resentments of his Jewish subjects. The Roman presence is the shadow that falls over everything. It's in the currency used at the market, coins bearing the image of a pagan emperor who called himself a god. It's in the tax collectors, men like Matthew, who sat at their booths and extracted wealth from the people to send to a distant capital. It's in the crucifixions that were a common and brutal public spectacle, a tool used to crush any hint of rebellion. The land itself felt occupied, groaning under a foreign weight. This pressure cooker of Roman occupation and local resentment produced a fractured society. There were the Sadducees, the wealthy priestly class in Jerusalem, who had learned to cooperate with Rome to maintain their power and the temple's function. There were the Pharisees, intensely pious laypeople who sought to apply God's law to every tiny aspect of daily life, believing that perfect obedience was the path to national restoration. On the fringes were the Zealots, revolutionaries who believed that God would only help those who took up the sword against their pagan oppressors. And out in the desert, groups like the Essenes pursued a life of ascetic purity, waiting for a final cosmic battle between good and evil. Everyone was waiting for something. They were waiting for a Messiah, a promised deliverer, an anointed one who would come and set things right. But what that meant, no one could quite agree on. Would he be a warrior king like David, who would drive the Romans into the sea? A priestly figure who would purify the temple? A heavenly judge who would descend on the clouds? Hope was a desperate, tangible thing, a currency as real as the denarius. It was a time of prophets and preachers, healers and holy men, each drawing crowds, each offering a different vision of salvation. It was into this fertile, fraught ground that Jesus of Nazareth would soon step. But for Mary, before she ever heard of Jesus, her world was much smaller and much darker. The Bible tells us something stark and terrifying about her. It says that from her had gone out 7 demons. Now, we have to be careful here. Our modern minds, shaped by centuries of horror movies and Gothic art, immediately leap to images of spinning heads and supernatural torment. But we need to try and hear that phrase with first-century ears. In that world, the line between the physical, the mental, and the spiritual was not so clearly drawn. A demon wasn't necessarily a little red monster with a pitchfork. The term could encompass a vast range of human suffering that seemed to come from outside, an invasive force that took over a person's life. It could be a severe, chronic physical ailment that defied all known remedies. Think of something like epilepsy, which was often described as a demonic affliction, the person thrown to the ground by an unseen power. It could be a form of severe mental illness, what we might today call clinical depression, bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia. Imagine the internal chaos, the voices, the crushing despair, the inability to connect with reality. It could be the deep, festering wound of trauma, perhaps from some unspeakable violence or loss, something that had shattered her spirit and left her fragmented, a prisoner of her own memories. The number 7 is key. In Jewish thought, 7 is the number of completion, of perfection, of totality. A week has 7 days. The creation was finished in 7 days. So, to say that Mary had 7 demons was a way of saying that her affliction was total. It was a complete and comprehensive devastation of her being. She wasn't just a little troubled or slightly unwell. She was utterly captive. Whatever her specific torment was, it had consumed her entire life. It would have defined her in the eyes of the community. Imagine the social stigma. In a world that often linked suffering to sin, either her own or her parents', she would have been an object of fear, pity, and suspicion. People might have crossed the street to avoid her. Children would be told to stay away. She would be isolated, cut off from the normal life of the community. She couldn't participate fully in the festivals, in the daily commerce, in the simple joys of friendship and family. Her life was a kind of living death. Let's try to imagine her internal world. What did it feel like? Perhaps it was a constant, screaming noise in her head, a chorus of accusatory and despairing voices that never fell silent. Maybe it was a crushing weight on her chest, a physical manifestation of a sorrow so profound she could barely breathe. Perhaps it was a volatile, unpredictable storm inside her, where moments of manic energy would give way to weeks of being unable to leave her bed. The world outside fading to a gray, meaningless blur. Maybe she saw things that weren't there, or was plagued by compulsions she couldn't control. Her relationships would have been shattered. How could you maintain a friendship when you were so unreliable, so lost in your own private hell? How could you hold down a job in the fish market, or at the loom when your own mind was your greatest enemy? Her days would be a battle, not for prosperity or for happiness, but simply for survival. To get through the next hour, the next minute, without being completely overwhelmed. She would have tried everything. Her family, if they were loving, would have exhausted their resources trying to help her. They would have taken her to the local synagogue, where the elders would pray over her, perhaps reciting passages from the Torah. They might have sought out healers, men who used folk remedies, herbs, and incantations passed down through generations. They might have advised fasting, or ritual baths in the sea, or pilgrimages to holy sites. And with every failed attempt, the despair would deepen. Her hope would shrivel. She would have come to believe that this was her lot in life, that she was permanently broken, a vessel made for suffering. This is the Mary who hears the first whispers about a man from Nazareth. The rumors would have started as a trickle and grown to a flood. They would be the talk of the marketplace, the gossip shared by women as they drew water from the town well, the stories debated by men mending their nets by the shore. They'd say he taught with a strange authority, not just quoting the old rabbis, but speaking as if he knew God personally. They'd say he wasn't afraid to eat with tax collectors and sinners, the very people a holy man was supposed to avoid. And most incredibly, they'd say he could heal, not just the simple fevers or the minor ailments. They'd say he made the lame walk, the blind see, the lepers clean. For someone in Mary's position, such stories would be both a torment and a tiny, flickering candle of hope in a vast darkness. She would have heard 100 such stories before. Galilee was full of would-be messiahs and miracle workers, but there was something different about the stories of this man, Jesus. The people who had actually seen him spoke of a compassion, a power that was different. They said he didn't use magical formulas or arcane rituals. Sometimes he just spoke a word. Sometimes he just touched someone. Maybe one day, the news spreads like wildfire through Magdala. He's coming here. Or perhaps he's in Capernaum, just a few miles up the road. A short walk. For someone who had been trapped in the prison of her own mind for years, the idea of walking a few miles might have seemed like climbing a mountain. It would have taken every ounce of will she possessed. She would have had to fight the voices that told her it was pointless, that he was just another fraud, that a woman as broken as her was beyond even his help. Let's imagine that moment. Let's imagine she makes the journey. She finds him by the shore of the sea, the same water she has known her whole life. But today, it looks different. There's a crowd, a huge press of bodies, all clamoring for his attention. The sick, the desperate, the curious, they are all there. The air is electric with anticipation. Getting close to him would be an ordeal. She would be pushed and jostled. People might recognize her and shrink away, whispering. She pushes through, driven by a desperation that is stronger than her fear, stronger than her shame. And then she sees him. He isn't what she expected. He doesn't have the grand robes of a temple priest or the wild look of a desert prophet. He looks like a man, a carpenter from Nazareth. He looks tired, perhaps. The demands of the crowd are endless. But as he speaks, his voice cuts through the noise. And as he looks at the people, his eyes see them. He doesn't just see a crowd of needs. He sees the person in front of him. Somehow she finds herself before him. Maybe she falls at his feet, unable to speak, her whole life of suffering contained in a single, desperate gesture. Maybe she just stands there, shaking, tears streaming down her face. And he looks at her. And for the first time in what feels like a lifetime, she feels seen. He doesn't see her 7 demons. He doesn't see the illness, the madness, the trauma. He doesn't see the woman the town whispers about. He sees her, Mary. We don't know what he said. The Gospels don't record the words of this specific healing. Perhaps there were no words. Perhaps it was a touch, a hand on her head, a quiet command not spoken to her, but to the darkness within her. And in that instant, everything changes. The healing for Mary would not have been a lightning bolt from the sky. It would have been a sunrise. It would have been the sudden, shocking cessation of a lifetime of noise. The screaming voices in her head fall silent. The crushing weight on her chest lifts. The chaos in her soul settles into a profound and unfamiliar peace. It is the feeling of a prisoner who has been locked in a dark, windowless cell for years, suddenly feeling the warmth of the sun and the fresh breeze on her face. It is the feeling of waking from a long and terrible nightmare. The world would look different. The colors of the water, the sky, the fishing boats, they would seem impossibly vibrant, as if she were seeing them for the first time. The faces of the people around her would no longer look like judges, but simply like people. The tears that fall are no longer tears of despair, but of a joy so deep, so overwhelming, it is almost painful. She is whole. The fragments of her shattered self have been gathered up and put back together. She is sane. She is free. This is not just a healing. It is a resurrection. She has been given her life back. And what is the only possible response to a gift like that? Gratitude is too small a word. Thankfulness is utterly inadequate. The only response is to give the life that has been given back to you to the one who gave it. Her old life in Magdala is over, not because she is banished, but because she is no longer the person who lived it. Her future is no longer a question mark, a terrifying void. Her future now has a face and a name: Jesus of Nazareth. The decision to follow him is not a calculated choice. It is an inevitability. It is the natural impulse of a plant turning toward the sun. Where else could she possibly go? What else could she possibly do? She joins the group that travels with him. Luke's gospel tells us this explicitly. It mentions her by name, first in a list of women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out, Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household, Susanna, and many others. And it says something remarkable about them. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. This is extraordinary. This wasn't just a band of 12 men wandering the countryside. It was a larger community, a movement, and at its financial and logistical heart were these women. Mary, who likely had some personal wealth, now uses it to fund this itinerant ministry. They are not just passive admirers, they are patrons, supporters, disciples, in a very real and practical sense. They handle the logistics. They make sure there is food, that there are places to sleep. They do the unseen, unglamorous work that allows the whole enterprise to function. While the male disciples are perhaps arguing about who will be greatest in the kingdom, these women are quietly and competently making the kingdom work on a day-to-day basis. For Mary, this new life is a complete transformation. Yesterday, she was a prisoner in her own home, an outcast. Today, she is on the road, part of an itinerant community, at the very center of the most exciting and important thing happening in the entire country. She is no longer defined by her brokenness. She is defined by her devotion. She is no longer Mary, the madwoman. She is Mary, the disciple. She has traded her prison for the open road, her isolation for a new family, her despair for a purpose so profound it will eventually lead her to the foot of a Roman cross and to the mouth of an empty tomb. Her journey has just begun. The woman from Magdala has been reborn, and her real story, the one that history would remember, is now starting to unfold. To be given your life back is one thing. To figure out what to do with it is another entirely. For Mary of Magdala, the new world that dawned after her healing was not a world of quiet contemplation or a gentle return to normalcy. Normalcy was gone. The old Mary was gone. The new Mary was a woman with a singular, gravitational purpose: to stay near the one who had made her whole. And so she walked. Life on the road became her new reality. The solid walls of her home in Magdala were replaced by the vast, open sky of Galilee. The familiar sounds of the fish market were swapped for the rhythmic crunch of sandals on dusty paths, the whisper of wind through fields of wheat, and the murmur of a crowd that seemed to swell and shrink like the tide. Discipleship, she was quickly learning, was not a concept or a creed. It was an act of constant motion. It was sore feet and a sunburnt neck. It was waking up with the dew cold on your cloak and not always knowing where you would lay your head that night. The landscape of Galilee became the new architecture of her life. They would walk paths that hugged the shore of the sea, the water a constant, calming presence on their right, its color shifting from turquoise to emerald to deep violet depending on the mood of the sky. She saw the fishing boats of her hometown from a new perspective now, not as a place of work, but as a backdrop to the unfolding story of Jesus. He would teach from one of those boats, pushed a little way from the shore, his voice carrying clearly over the water to the crowds assembled on the beach. Other days, the path would lead them inland, up into the hills. The air would grow thinner, cooler. The lush green of the lakeshore would give way to rocky soil, hardy olive trees clinging to the slopes, their silver-green leaves shimmering in the heat. Evenings were a time of shared weariness and quiet community. Sometimes they found hospitality in a village, crowding into the small courtyard of a supporter's home, sharing a simple meal of bread, olives, and cheese. The air would be filled with the chatter of the day, the excited retelling of a healing, the debate over a particularly puzzling parable. Jesus, often looking exhausted from the endless demands of the crowds, would still find time to speak with the children or offer a quiet word of encouragement to a troubled soul. Mary would watch him, her heart filled with a protective sort of awe. She saw the human cost of his divine work. On other nights, when no town would receive them, or when they sought solitude, they slept in the open. They'd find a sheltered spot, perhaps in an olive grove on a hillside overlooking the sea. A fire would be built, its flickering light pushing back the immense darkness of the rural night. The stars in that ancient sky, with no city lights to dim them, were a brilliant, shocking spray of diamonds. Lying on the hard ground, wrapped in her cloak, Mary would look up at that silent, spinning majesty and feel the immensity of the change in her life. Not so long ago, a night like this would have been a landscape of terror. her mind a canvas for her demons to paint their nightmares upon. Now, it was a cathedral. It was peace. The soft snores of the other disciples, the crackle of the dying fire, the distant call of a night bird. These were the sounds of her new family, her new safety. And it was a family. A strange, motley, wonderful family. There were the 12, of course. Peter, the big fisherman, so full of bluster and passionate declarations, his heart always a step ahead of his brain. His brother Andrew, quieter, more thoughtful. The brothers James and John, the sons of thunder, whose fiery intensity sometimes needed to be gently reined in by Jesus. Philip, the practical one. Nathanael, the initial skeptic who had been won over so completely. Matthew, the tax collector, still carrying a certain quiet precision from his old life, now using it in service of a new master. And the others, each with their own quirks and strengths and deep flaws. Mary watched them, listened to them. She saw their devotion, but she also saw their ambition, their frequent misunderstandings, their arguments over who was the most important. They were men, after all, and they were still trying to fit Jesus into their very male ideas of power and kingdoms. But Mary's more immediate family was the cohort of women. The Gospels name her first, a place of honor, perhaps indicating a leading role. Then there was Joanna, a fascinating and somewhat improbable disciple. She was the wife of Chusa, who was nothing less than the household manager for Herod Antipas. This meant Joanna moved in the highest circles of Galilean power. She would have lived in Tiberias, in a world of political intrigue, Roman influence, and immense wealth, a world utterly alien to the fishermen and farmers who made up most of the disciples. What suffering had she endured that led her to this dusty Nazarene? What courage did it take for her to leave that life of comfort, or at least to publicly align herself with this controversial preacher? Her presence in the group was a quiet testament to the fact that Jesus' message was cutting across every social stratum. And there was Susanna, and the Gospels add many others. It wasn't just 2 or 3. It was a substantial group. A sisterhood was forged on those roads. They would have walked together, their conversation a low hum beneath the louder talk of the men. They would have shared the practical burdens. When a sandal strap broke, another would have a spare piece of leather. When water skins ran low, they would know the quickest way to the village well. They would have tended to the blisters, the coughs, the simple human ailments that came with this life. There was a quiet competence to their discipleship. And then there was that crucial detail. They supported the ministry out of their own means. This was no small thing. It was the financial engine of the movement. A group of 13 men plus Jesus, plus the women themselves, plus a wider circle of followers, all needed to be fed and sometimes housed. That took resources. Mary, Joanna, and the others were not just followers, they were the patrons. They were the finance committee, the logistics officers, the quartermasters of this traveling army of peace. Imagine Mary in a village market at the end of a long day's walk. While Peter and John might be caught up in an exciting debate about scripture, Mary would be the one quietly, efficiently bartering with a baker for a basket of flatbread. She'd be the one calculating how many olives and how much cheese they would need for the evening meal and the next day's journey. She'd be negotiating with an innkeeper, not for a room, that was a luxury, but perhaps for the right to sleep in their stable or courtyard. Joanna might use her knowledge of how large households were run to organize the group, to make sure everyone, especially the children or the elderly who sometimes followed, had a share. This practical service was a form of worship, a tangible expression of their gratitude. For Mary, every loaf of bread she bought was a prayer. Every cloak she mended was a hymn. She, who had been so lost in the chaos of her own mind, now found a profound sense of purpose in creating order, in providing, in sustaining the physical life of the man who had restored her spiritual life. Her past of utter helplessness had been redeemed into a present of profound competence. She didn't need to be the one to speak to the crowd of thousands. She didn't need to be the one to perform the miracle. Her role was to make sure the one who did those things had the strength to continue. And in that role, she found a deep and abiding dignity. She was also a student. Her discipleship was not just one of service, but of listening and learning. She was a witness to a revolution in thinking, a new way of seeing God and the world, all unfolding in the parables and teachings Jesus gave day after day. Imagine her sitting on a grassy hillside, the crowd spread out before Jesus like a great patchwork quilt. He begins to tell a story, the parable of the sower. Mary listens, and the story comes alive for her in a deeply personal way. She knows these images. She's seen the farmers casting seed. She's seen the hard-packed path at the edge of the field where nothing can take root. She thinks of the religious leaders she's seen, their minds so closed, so certain of their own righteousness that Jesus' words just bounce off them. She's seen the rocky ground, the shallow soil where plants spring up quickly in a burst of enthusiasm, but wither under the first heat of opposition. She thinks of some in the crowd who are swept up in the excitement of the miracles, but will fall away as soon as following Jesus becomes difficult or unpopular. She knows the thorny ground. Oh, she knows it well from her life in Magdala. The thorns are the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth. In her bustling commercial hometown, she had seen people choked by their anxieties, their constant striving for more money, more status. She'd seen how that striving could leave no room for God, no space for anything transcendent to grow. And then he speaks of the good soil. The heart that hears the word, accepts it, and produces a crop. And her own heart aches with recognition. She is that good soil, not because she was naturally virtuous or wise, far from it, but because her own soil had been plowed by suffering. Her pride had been broken, her self-sufficiency shattered. Her heart had been tilled and made ready when the seed of his word, of his healing, had landed in her. It found a place to take root and grow into this new, strong, fruit-bearing life of discipleship. The parable wasn't just a clever story for the crowd. It was the story of her own soul. She would have been there for the other stories too. When Jesus spoke of a tiny mustard seed growing into a great bush where the birds of the air could come and perch, she wouldn't have just heard a lesson about the kingdom of God. She would have felt it. Her own healing had started with a seed of hope, so small she could barely detect it. Now, that hope had grown into a life so large and full that others could, perhaps, find shelter in her strength and her testimony. When he told the story of a woman who lost a precious coin and swept her whole house clean, lighting a lamp and searching diligently until she found it, then calling all her friends to rejoice, Mary would have wept, for she was that lost coin. She had been lost in the darkness of her own home, her own mind. And God, like that relentless woman, had searched for her, had swept away the darkness, and was now rejoicing over her being found. She would have been present for the private explanations, too. After the crowds had dispersed, Jesus would gather the smaller group of his disciples around him. In the quiet of the evening, he would unpack the meanings of the stories. Mary, along with the other women, would likely have been there, sitting on the periphery, listening intently. She would hear him explain the mysteries of the kingdom, and she would watch the 12 bless them, as they so often missed the point. They'd ask him literal-minded questions. They'd get caught up in the details and miss the spiritual truth. They'd hear kingdom and immediately start thinking about thrones and power structures. There was a gentle, almost humorous irony in it that Mary would have perceived. The men, who were so often in the foreground, were frequently the last to understand. While they were busy posturing and arguing, she and the other women were quietly absorbing the heart of the message. Perhaps their exclusion from the official power structures of their society gave them an advantage. They had no thrones to aspire to. They weren't jockeying for positions as chief ministers in a new government. Their egos were not so entangled in the outcome. And so, they could hear the message more clearly. They could understand that the kingdom Jesus spoke of was not about power, but about service, not about greatness, but about humility, not about being first, but about being last. And then there were the miracles. For the crowds, they were spectacles, signs of power, proof of divine authority. For Mary, each miracle was a deeply personal echo of her own deliverance. They were not just displays of power, they were expressions of a compassion so profound it could reorder the very fabric of reality. She would never forget the day they crossed the sea to the country of the Gerasenes. It was Gentile territory, a place of unease for many of the Jewish disciples. And there, they were met by a man who was the embodiment of human degradation. He lived in a graveyard, naked, screaming, so violent that no one could restrain him. The locals said he was possessed by a legion of demons, while the other disciples shrank back in fear and disgust. Mary would have looked at this man and felt a painful, gut-wrenching empathy. She knew that prison. She knew what it was to be at war with your own mind, to be a terrifying stranger to yourself. She understood the isolation, the shame, the feeling of being utterly beyond human help. She saw in his wild eyes the same torment that had once lived in hers. So when Jesus spoke to the man, not with fear, but but with calm authority, and commanded the unclean spirits to leave. Mary's whole being was focused on the moment. The healing of this one forsaken man was for her a reaffirmation of her own salvation. When she saw him later, sitting at Jesus' feet, dressed and in his right mind, the same profound peace on his face that she now felt in her own soul, it was as if she were being healed all over again. She was there in the press of the crowd when the desperate woman with the issue of blood pushed her way through. For 12 years, this woman had been bleeding. According to Jewish law, this made her perpetually unclean. She was a social and religious outcast, just as Mary had been. She couldn't touch anyone, couldn't participate in temple worship, couldn't live a normal life. Mary would have felt the woman's desperation as a physical force. She would have understood the courage it took for her to violate the taboos, to risk public humiliation, just for the chance to touch the hem of Jesus' garment. And when Jesus stopped, when he felt the power go out from him and asked, "Who touched me?" Mary knew it wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation. He wanted to bring the woman out of the shadows, to heal her not just physically, but socially, to restore her to the community with dignity. Mary saw in that woman a sister in suffering and a sister in salvation. And that same day, to see Jesus take the hand of the dead daughter of Jairus, the synagogue leader, and say, "Little girl, I say to you, get up," was to witness the ultimate confirmation of his power. He didn't just mend broken minds or heal diseased bodies. He conquered death itself. For a woman who had been living a kind of death for years, this was the ultimate sign of hope. There was no pit so deep that his love could not reach into it. There was no darkness so final that his light could not overcome it, being a constant witness to this power. And this teaching began to subtly reshape her understanding of the world. But it also began to open her eyes to the danger. This was not a triumphant parade through a welcoming countryside. Every miracle created enemies. Every teaching that challenged the religious establishment drew their ire. She saw the looks on the faces of the Pharisees when Jesus healed on the Sabbath. They saw not an act of compassion, but a violation of their sacred rules. Their faces would tighten, their lips would thin, and they would mutter to each other, their piety curdling into a cold fury. She heard the scribes and the teachers of the law challenge him, trying to trap him in his words, to trick him into saying something blasphemous or seditious. She saw them not as men seeking truth, but as lawyers building a case against him. The atmosphere began to change. The early, sun-drenched days in Galilee, filled with wonder and excitement, slowly began to be tinged with a sense of foreboding. The crowds were still large, but now they contained hostile faces, spies, and informants. Mary, with her heightened sensitivity born of past trauma, would have been keenly aware of this shift. She would feel the tension in the air, see the subtle threats that the other, more boisterous disciples might miss, and she would hear the shift in Jesus' own teaching. He began to speak more openly to his disciples about what was to come. He told them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, that he would be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. The first time she heard him say this, a cold dread would have filled her. It made no sense. How could the one with all power, the one who could raise the dead, be killed? It was a contradiction, a puzzle she couldn't solve. She would have watched the disciples' reaction. Peter, in his typical fashion, rebuked Jesus, telling him this could never happen. And she saw Jesus turn on his most loyal disciple with a terrifying severity, calling him Satan, a stumbling block. The message was clear. Their ideas of messiahship, of a victorious king, were not just wrong, they were a temptation, a distraction from the true, painful path that lay ahead. Jesus started talking about the cost of following him. If anyone would come after me, he said, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. A cross. For a first-century resident of Roman-occupied Galilee, a cross was not a pretty piece of jewelry. It was not a religious symbol. It was an instrument of horrific, state-sponsored torture and execution. It was the ultimate symbol of Roman power and human degradation. To hear Jesus speak of taking one up was shocking, terrifying, while the men were perhaps still dreaming of a coming glory, of sitting on thrones at his right and his left. Mary's understanding of discipleship was being forged in a different fire. She had never been drawn to Jesus by a promise of power or status. She had been drawn to him by his mercy. Her loyalty wasn't conditional on victory. It was rooted in gratitude. And gratitude is a much stronger foundation than ambition. She had already lost her life once to the 7 demons. Jesus had given it back to her. It was his. If following him meant walking a path that led to suffering, to rejection, even to a cross, then that is the path she would walk. Her past had, in a strange way, prepared her for this. She had already known the depths of despair. She had already faced the worst that life could throw at her. It had made her resilient. It had burned away the illusions that so many others held. She knew that true life was not about comfort or security or what other people thought of you. True life was about being near the source of life itself. And so she continued to walk. She continued to serve, to listen, to watch. The sun still warmed the Galilean hills. The sea still sparkled. But a shadow was lengthening from the south, from Jerusalem. The journey was turning toward its final, fateful destination. And Mary of Magdala, the woman who had been saved from a living death, was quietly, resolutely preparing her heart to follow her healer all the way to the end, whatever that end might be. The journey south was different this time. They had traveled the road from Galilee to Judea before, but now the air itself felt charged, heavy with unspoken possibilities. It was the time of Passover, the great pilgrimage festival, and the roads were choked with people. Entire villages seemed to be on the move, families walking together, their donkeys laden with supplies. There was a festive spirit, a current of excitement that ran through the crowds, the sound of psalms being sung, the laughter of children. But for Mary and the others in Jesus' inner circle, this celebratory mood was a thin veil over a deep and growing anxiety. With every step that took them farther from the familiar hills of Galilee and closer to the formidable walls of Jerusalem, The sense of foreboding intensified. The landscape itself seemed to mirror the shift in mood. The lush greenery that bordered the sea gave way to the stark, sun-bleached limestone hills of Judea. The earth became stonier, the vegetation sparser. It was a beautiful but severe landscape, a landscape that demanded resilience. Jesus was different, too. The urgency that had always been present in his teaching now burned with a new fire. He spoke more plainly of his coming betrayal and death. He seemed to be looking at the world, at the people around him, with a heartbreaking tenderness, as if seeing them for the last time. Mary watched him, her heart a knot of confusion and sorrow. How could she reconcile the man who spoke with such certainty of his own destruction with the man she had seen command the wind and the waves? It was a paradox her mind could not solve. She, who had been delivered from the chaos of her own mind, now found herself in a world that was rapidly losing its sense. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She served. She focused on the practicalities, making sure there was water for the journey, mending a tear in another disciple's cloak, helping to distribute the evening meal. These small, ordinary tasks became her anchor in a sea of uncertainty. By caring for the physical needs of the group, she could, for a moment, quiet the storm of questions in her soul. She kept her fear close and her hands busy. Her love had always been practical, and now, in the face of the unspeakable, it became her shield. And then they arrived. The first sight of Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives was always breathtaking. The city spread out before them, its pale stone walls glowing in the afternoon sun, crowned by the magnificent, gleaming edifice of the temple. It was the heart of their world, the place where God was said to dwell on earth. As the great pilgrim crowds saw it, a roar of joyful praise would often go up. This time, the entry into the city was unlike any other. What started as a small procession of Jesus and his disciples swelled into a spontaneous, chaotic, and joyful parade. People began to recognize him. The stories of his miracles, especially the recent raising of Lazarus in nearby Bethany, had preceded them. A frenzy of excitement gripped the crowd. They threw their cloaks on the dusty road before him, a gesture of honor reserved for a king. They tore branches from the palm trees and waved them, shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David." For a moment, it was intoxicating. Mary, caught in the midst of this swirling, shouting mass of humanity, might have felt a surge of hope. Was this it? Was this the moment? Were the people finally recognizing him for who he was? Perhaps all his dark talk of suffering was a metaphor. Perhaps this was the victory he had been speaking of. She looked at the other disciples. Peter's face was beaming. James and John looked as though they were already measuring the drapes for their new offices in the royal palace. For this one brief, shining moment, their dreams seemed to be coming true. But then Mary looked at Jesus. He was riding on a young donkey, not a conquering warhorse. It was a deliberate choice, an echo of a prophecy from Zechariah about a gentle, peaceful king. And there was no look of triumph on his face. as he rounded the bend, and the full panorama of the city and the temple came into view, his shoulders began to shake. He was weeping. Tears were carving paths through the dust on his cheeks. If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, he said, his voice thick with sorrow. But now it is hidden from your eyes. In that moment, Mary's heart broke. She understood. The crowd's cheers were hollow. They were cheering for a king who would save them from the Romans, not a savior who would save them from themselves. They were waving palms, but their hearts were not prepared. Jesus wasn't entering the city as a conqueror. He was entering it as a sacrifice. This wasn't a coronation, it was a funeral procession. The shouts of Hosanna would, within a week, curdle into screams of crucify him. She knew it with a certainty that chilled her to the bone. The brief, sunny triumph on the road was just the prologue to a deep and terrible darkness. The week that followed was a blur of tension and confrontation. Jesus taught daily in the temple courts, and his presence, there was a direct challenge to the authorities who ran the place. Mary would watch from the edge of the crowds, listening as he deftly parried the verbal traps set for him by the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes. They came at him with questions about taxes, about the resurrection, about his authority, and he answered them with a wisdom so clear and profound that it left them speechless and infuriated. The admiration of the common people for him grew, and with it, the hatred of the powerful. The breaking point came with the event that would be known as the cleansing of the temple. Mary was there when he entered the outer court, the court of the Gentiles, and saw it transformed into a noisy, chaotic marketplace. The tables of the money changers, who gouged the pilgrims by exchanging their Roman coins for the special temple currency, were everywhere. The pens of the animal sellers, who charged exorbitant prices for supposedly unblemished sacrifices, filled the air with noise and filth. It was a system of religious exploitation, a barrier preventing sincere people from approaching God. What Mary saw in Jesus was not a fit of uncontrollable rage. It was a display of pure, passionate, heartbreaking grief. He braided a cord into a small whip, and with a controlled, deliberate fury, he drove them out. He overturned the tables, the coins scattering across the stone pavement with a clatter that silenced the entire courtyard. "It is written," he thundered, his voice echoing off the columns. "My house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." It was an act of holy rebellion. It was a direct assault on the corrupt and profitable system the temple authorities had built. In that moment, Mary knew there was no turning back. He had signed his own death warrant. The looks on the faces of the priests and the guards were no longer just looks of annoyance. They were looks of murder. From that day on, they actively sought a way to destroy him. Amidst the growing darkness of that week, there was one moment of profound and tender beauty. It happened in the nearby village of Bethany, in the home of a man named Simon, whom Jesus had once healed of leprosy. As they were reclining for a meal, a woman came into the room. She was carrying a small, beautiful alabaster jar. Without a word, she broke the seal on the jar and poured its contents, an incredibly expensive perfume made from pure nard, over Jesus' head and feet. The room was instantly filled with a fragrance so rich and beautiful, it was intoxicating. It was an act of extravagant, reckless love. Immediately, the mood was broken by the grumbling of some of the disciples. Mary heard Judas Iscariot's voice, sharp with indignation. Why this waste? This perfume could have been sold for more than a year's wages, and the money given to the poor. It sounded so pious, so reasonable. But Mary, watching Jesus' face, knew they were missing the point entirely. Jesus silenced them. "Leave her alone," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want. But you will not always have me." And then he said the words that made Mary's blood run cold. "She poured this perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial." He understood. In this woman's beautiful, seemingly irrational act, he saw an act of profound prophetic understanding. She was the one who was really paying attention. She was the one who had heard his words about his coming death and had taken them to heart. While the men were still arguing about positions of power, this woman was performing the rites of death. She was anointing his body for the tomb. It was an act of grief, of love, of acceptance of the terrible thing that was to come. Mary looked at this woman with a surge of kinship. Here was a soul who understood. Here was a love that was not afraid of the darkness, a love that was willing to perform the final, necessary, heartbreaking tasks. It was a love Mary understood in her own bones. The final night came all too quickly. The night of the Passover meal. Jesus had arranged for a private room, an upper room somewhere in the tangled streets of Jerusalem, where he could share this Last Supper with the 12. Mary and the other women were not present at that table. Their role was, as always, one of preparation and support. They would have helped secure the provisions, the unleavened bread, the wine, the bitter herbs, the lamb. They likely ate their own Passover meal in a nearby room. They're quiet, anxious, gathering a stark contrast to the intense, world-changing drama happening just a wall away. Mary could only imagine the conversation in that room, the strange finality she had felt from Jesus all week, now reaching its crescendo. Later, under the light of a full Passover moon, Jesus led his closest disciples, Peter, James, and John, to a familiar place of prayer, an olive grove on the side of the Mount of Olives called Gethsemane. Mary and the other women likely followed at a distance. They had become his shadow, his silent, watchful guard. They found a place where they could wait, hidden among the ancient, gnarled olive trees, while he went further into the garden to pray. The wait was an agony of suspense. The night was still, the air cool. From their hiding place, they could see the flicker of lamplight in Jerusalem, hear the distant sounds of the city. But in the garden, a profound and terrible struggle was taking place. They could not hear his words, but they could feel his anguish. They saw him fall to the ground, his body contorted in prayer. This was the man who had faced down demons and disease without flinching, now seemingly crushed by a sorrow that was more than human. And then the spell was broken. A new light appeared at the edge of the garden, a line of torches weaving its way up the path from the Kidron Valley. Mary's heart seized. She heard the clank of armor, the guttural commands of soldiers. A crowd was coming, and at its head, she could just make out the figure of one of their own, Judas. The scene that followed was a blur of nightmarish chaos. Judas stepping forward to kiss Jesus, the prearranged signal of betrayal. The soldiers surging forward, grabbing him. Peter, in a flash of misguided bravery, drawing a sword and cutting off a man's ear. Jesus' calm voice cutting through the panic, healing the man, submitting to the arrest. And then, the most heartbreaking sight of all, the disciples, the men who had sworn they would die for him, scattering into the darkness. They ran. They abandoned him. They left him alone with his enemies. But they weren't all gone. From the shadows of the olive trees, a small group of women watched, paralyzed by horror and grief. Mary was among them. They did not run. Their love was not the kind that could be broken by fear. Their place was with him, even if all they could do was watch, helpless, as he was led away like a common criminal into the darkness. What followed was a long, cold, terrifying night of injustice. As Jesus was dragged through the city, from the house of the high priest Annas to the court of Caiaphas, Mary and a few others followed. They kept to the shadows of Jerusalem's narrow, winding streets, their cloaks pulled tight around them, their hearts pounding. They had to know what was happening. They could not abandon him to the night. They may have found their way into the courtyard of the high priest's house, mingling with the servants and onlookers huddled around a charcoal fire for warmth. It was here, in the flickering firelight, that Mary would have witnessed another kind of heartbreak. She saw Peter, big, brave Peter, the rock, being confronted by a servant girl. She heard his voice, tight with fear, as he denied even knowing Jesus. Once, twice, and then a third time with curses. And as the rooster crowed, just as Jesus had predicted, she saw their eyes meet across the courtyard. She saw the look of recognition and shame on Peter's face as he stumbled out into the night, weeping bitterly. Mary felt no judgment, only a deep, shared sorrow. She understood the power of fear, and it made the simple, stubborn courage that kept her there feel all the more vital. The rest of the night was a mockery of justice. She watched through a doorway, or listened to the reports filtering out into the courtyard. She heard the shouts of the false witnesses, their stories contradicting each other. She heard the high priest's final, fateful question, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And she heard Jesus' clear, calm, and damning reply, "I am." She heard the tearing of the high priest's robes, the chorus of condemnation. She heard the sounds of blows, the cruel laughter as they blindfolded him and spat on him, mocking him. Every sound was a blow to her own soul. This was the man who had healed her, who had brought peace to her tormented mind, now being treated with a barbarity she could barely comprehend. As dawn broke, a gray and joyless light filtering over the city, They led him to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. The ordeal continued. The cynical, politically minded Roman, caught between the demands of the furious priests and his own sense of Jesus' innocence, tried to wash his hands of the affair. He sent him to Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, Joanna's husband's boss, who treated Jesus as a court jester, and sent him back. Pilate offered the crowd a choice: release this man or release Barabbas, a murderer and insurrectionist. And Mary stood in that crowd, a tiny island of grief in a sea of manipulated rage, and heard the people, the same people who had shouted Hosanna just days before, scream for Barabbas. And when Pilate asked what he should do with Jesus, the cry came back, a single, bloodthirsty roar: crucify him. The sentence was passed. The walk to the place of execution, a quarry outside the city walls called Golgotha, the place of the skull, began. The cross, the heavy, brutal instrument of his death, was laid on his already scourged and bleeding back. Mary walked with the crowd that followed, her every step an act of will. The noise, the soldiers' shouts, the weeping of other women, the jeers of the onlookers, it all merged into a sensory assault. She was in a waking nightmare, but she would not close her eyes. She would not turn away. She had to see this through to its bitter end. And then she was there, at the foot of the cross. John's gospel makes it clear she was there, standing, not collapsed in a heap, not hidden in the distance, but standing, alongside Jesus' mother, his aunt, and the disciple John. While the other men, Peter included, were locked away in fear, this small, loyal, courageous group of women bore witness. To stand at the foot of a Roman cross was to position yourself at the nexus of human cruelty, imperial power, and ultimate degradation. It was an obscene and terrifying spectacle designed to crush the spirit of anyone who watched. And Mary stood there for hours. The details of those hours would be burned into her memory forever. The sound of the hammer striking the nails, the sickening thud as the cross was dropped into its hole, the labored, ragged breaths of the man she loved as he fought for every gasp of air, the jeers of the soldiers gambling for his clothes, the taunts from the religious leaders who had orchestrated this. He saved others, but he can't save himself. Her mind would have been a maelstrom. Every cell in her body screamed for it to stop. Memories would have flooded her. A day by the sea when he told a story, the look on his face when he healed the Gerasene man, his gentle touch, his tired smile at the end of a long day. All these moments of life and light, now mocked by this obscene spectacle of death. The questions would have torn at her. Why? Why was he letting this happen? Where was the God he called Father? It felt like the sun was being extinguished from the sky, like the whole world was being plunged into the same darkness she had once known in her own soul. Yet she did not leave. Her presence was her final gift. It was an act of defiance against the cruelty, an act of love in the face of hatred, an act of loyalty in a world of betrayal. She was saying with her very body, I am still here. I will not abandon you. You are not alone. She listened to his words from that terrible throne, his plea for his executioner's forgiveness. his promise of paradise to the thief beside him, his provision for his mother, entrusting her to John, and finally, his last agonizing cries. The cry of abandonment, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And the final whispered word of completion, "It is finished." She watched as his head slumped forward, as the life went out of the man who was life itself. Even then, her work was not done. She remained a silent sentinel of grief, as a soldier pierced his side with a spear to confirm his death. She watched as two brave, secret disciples, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, went to Pilate and were given permission to take down the body. Her love remained practical to the very end. She watched them wrap his broken, lifeless form in clean linen. She followed them to a new tomb, carved into a rock in a nearby garden, a tomb that had never been used. She watched them roll the great, heavy stone across the entrance as the sun was setting, as the Sabbath was beginning. There was no time for a proper burial, no time to anoint his body with the traditional spices and perfumes. That final act of love and respect had been stolen from them by the setting sun. And so, in the gathering twilight, Mary of Magdala finally turned away from the tomb. Her Lord was dead. The hope of Israel was sealed in a borrowed grave. The world was dark and empty. But in her heart, a single, stubborn, practical thought took root. The Sabbath would pass, and on the first day of the week, as soon as it was legally possible, she would be back. She had one last act of service to perform. She would come back to anoint his body. Her devotion would outlast his death. There is a particular kind of silence that falls after a great tragedy. It isn't peace. It's the sound of absence. It's the deafening quiet in a house that was once filled with laughter. For Mary of Magdala and the other disciples, the Sabbath that followed the crucifixion was filled with that silence. The law demanded they rest, but there was no rest in them. They were hidden away, locked in a room somewhere in the hostile city of Jerusalem, prisoners of their own fear and a grief so vast it seemed to have blotted out the sun. That Sabbath was the longest day of Mary's life. Every hour stretched into an eternity. Her mind, the mind that Jesus had so mercifully quieted, was now a relentless tormentor, but in a new and terrible way. It was no longer the chaotic screaming of her old demons. It was a cold, clear, unending loop of the last 48 hours. The betrayal in the garden, the mockery of a trial, Peter's denial in the firelight, the savage scourging, the jeering crowds, the slow, agonizing walk to Golgotha, the sound of the nails, his voice hoarse with pain, his last breath, and then the image that would not leave her, the great, indifferent stone rolled into place, sealing him in the darkness. She would close her eyes, and it was all there, playing again and again. The hope that had blossomed in her life, that had remade her from the inside out, was gone. It hadn't just faded, it had been brutally, publicly, and shamefully extinguished. The man who was the source of all life was now dead. It was a contradiction that shattered the very foundations of reality. If he could be defeated, then what hope was there for anyone? It felt as though the darkness she had been rescued from had returned, not just to her, but to the whole world. It was a quiet, empty hell, a universe drained of meaning and light. They were all broken. Peter was likely catatonic with shame and grief. John, burdened with the new responsibility of caring for Jesus' mother, was enveloped in a quiet sorrow. The others were simply terrified, starting at every sound from the street, expecting a knock on the door at any moment from the temple guards or Roman soldiers, coming to round up the followers of the executed criminal. But in the midst of this paralysis of despair, a small, practical thought sustained Mary and the other women. It was an anchor in the storm. The spices. His body had been buried in such haste, with none of the proper rites. He had been wrapped in linen, but he had not been anointed. It was the final act of love and respect afforded to the dead, a way to honor the vessel that had once held a beloved soul. It was a task left undone, and in their profound grief, this one concrete task was the only thing that made sense. It was a duty, a final service. They would have spent the last moments before the Sabbath began on Friday evening, gathering what they needed. Myrrh, a bitter resin used in embalming, and aloes, a fragrant wood. It was expensive, a final, extravagant gift, much like the perfume poured on his feet in Bethany. This simple, practical plan to go to the tomb as soon as the law allowed and perform this last, heartbreaking act of tenderness was the only thing that moved them forward through the suffocating stillness of that Sabbath. It was a love that refused to be paralyzed, a devotion that insisted on acting, even when all hope was dead. It was, in its own way, an act of faith, though they had no idea what they were having faith in. It was simply the faith of love itself, the belief that the beloved must be cared for, even in death. And so, before the sun had even thought about rising on the first day of the week, they were up. The city of Jerusalem was still cloaked in the deep, inky darkness of the pre-dawn hours. A chill, damp air hung in the narrow stone streets. It was a quiet born of exhaustion, the quiet of a city that had spent its passion and was now sleeping it off. Mary, along with Mary, the mother of James, and Salome, slipped out of the room where they had been hiding. Their movements were quiet, furtive. They carried their bundled spices, the fragrance a strange and poignant counterpoint to the grimness of their errand. The walk through the sleeping city was eerie. Their own footsteps on the stone pavement seemed impossibly loud. The sound of their breathing, the rustle of their cloaks, the soft clinking of the spice jars, these were the only sounds in the world. They were three small, determined shadows moving through a world of gray. Their conversation, if there was any, would have been in hushed whispers. There was nothing left to say, really. Their shared grief was a heavy cloak they all wore. They were simply a committee of sorrow, on their way to perform their final duty. As they walked, a practical and frankly enormous problem began to dawn on them. A problem they had perhaps overlooked in the fog of their grief. They whispered to one another, their voices tight with worry. Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb for us? It's such a beautifully human detail. The stone was massive. It would have taken several strong men to move it. They were 3 women, exhausted from grief and lack of sleep. What were they thinking? What was their plan? The truth is, they probably didn't have one. Their love was driving them forward, far ahead of their logic. They were going anyway. They would get there, and they would figure it out. Perhaps they could find someone, a kind stranger, a gardener's assistant, who would help them. Or perhaps they would just sit outside the tomb, their purpose thwarted, their final act of love blocked by a giant piece of rock. It didn't matter. They had to go. Their devotion was an irrational force, a love that would walk right up to an impossible obstacle without a plan, simply because it had to be near its object. They cleared the city walls and made their way to the garden where the tomb was located. The first faint hint of dawn was beginning to soften the eastern sky, turning it from black to a deep indigo. The air smelled of damp earth and the cool, green scent of the garden's plants. And as they approached the place, their eyes straining in the gloom, they saw it, and they stopped, dead in their tracks. Something was wrong. The shape of the tomb against the rock face was not as they remembered it. The great, dark circle of the stone that should have sealed the entrance was gone, vanished. There was just a gaping, black opening. This was not a moment of joy. This was a moment of pure terror. Their hearts, already so heavy with grief, now began to pound with a new and horrifying fear. Their immediate thought was not a miracle. Their immediate thought was a desecration. Grave robbers. Someone had come in the night, violated the tomb, and stolen the body. It was the final, unthinkable insult. Not only had his enemies killed him, but now they had taken away even his place of rest, denying him the dignity of a proper grave. It was a cruelty beyond measure. For Mary of Magdala, this was the breaking point. John's Gospel tells us that she didn't even wait for the others. She didn't look inside. The sight of that open, empty space was enough to send her into a full-blown panic. All thought of anointing the body was gone, replaced by a frantic, desperate need to tell someone. She turned and she ran. She ran back the way she had come, her breath catching in her throat, tears of a new and terrible kind streaming down her face. She must have flown through the streets, a specter of panic in the graying dawn. She ran to the place where the disciples were hiding. She must have pounded on the door, her voice choked with sobs. When they finally let her in, the words tumbled out of her, a torrent of horrified grief. "They have taken the Lord out of Thedum," she gasped, "and we do not know where they have put him." Notice her words. Not, "He is risen." Not, "There's been a miracle." Her message was one of theft, of desecration, of loss compounded by a final, terrible violation. Her panic was contagious. Peter and the other disciple, the one the Gospel identifies as the one Jesus loved traditionally, John, were on their feet instantly. They had to see for themselves. And so began one of the most poignant foot races in history. The two of them, running through the awakening streets of Jerusalem toward the tomb. John, being younger, outran the older, more heavily built Peter. He arrived first, breathless, and stopped at the entrance. He stooped down, peered into the gloom, and saw the linen grave clothes lying there. But he hesitated, perhaps out of awe or fear or a respect for the sacred space. A moment later, Peter came barreling up, impulsive as ever. He didn't hesitate. He charged straight into the tomb, and John followed. And what they saw stopped them in their tracks. It wasn't the scene of a grave robbery. Grave robbers would have been messy, hasty. They would have ripped the valuable linen wrappings off the body and discarded them in a heap. But that's not what they saw. The long strips of linen that had been wrapped around his body were lying there, as if the body had simply evaporated out of them. And the smaller cloth, the saudarian that had been wrapped around his head, was not with the other linens. It was folded up neatly, set in a place by itself. It was a detail of profound and baffling strangeness. It was a sign of order, of deliberation. It was as if someone had woken up from a sleep and had calmly and carefully folded their bedclothes before leaving. It was a sign that made no sense. The gospel says that John saw and believed, but what did he believe? Not necessarily the full resurrection, not yet. But he believed that something inexplicable and divine had happened here. The theory of grave robbers no longer held water. Deeply confused, trying to process what they had seen, the two men left the garden and went back to their homes, back to the locked room to think, to wonder. But Mary had followed them back to the garden, and when they left, she stayed. This is perhaps the single most important detail in the story. The men, with their need to analyze and process, went back. Mary, with her need to be near, remained. She could not leave this place. It was the last place she had seen him. Her grief was a physical chain binding her to this spot. So she stood outside the tomb, alone in the now brightening garden, and she wept. Her tears were not the quiet, gentle tears of mourning. This was the raw, guttural sobbing of a soul that had reached the absolute end of its endurance. He had been taken from her by the cross. Now his body, the last physical remnant of him in the world, the focus of her final act of love, was also gone. Her love had nowhere to go. It was a powerful, surging river that had been dammed on all sides. She was utterly, completely bereft. Through her blur of tears, she did what the men had done. She stooped and looked into the tomb, and she saw something they had not reported seeing. The tomb was no longer empty. It was filled with a soft light, and there were two figures there, dressed in robes as white as lightning. Angels. One was sitting where Jesus' head had been, the other where his feet had been. In any other circumstance, this sight would have been terrifying, shocking her into silence. But Mary's grief was so immense, so all-consuming, that it overshadowed even the supernatural. They were just two more strange details in a morning that had been full of them, and the angels spoke to her. Their question was not a rebuke, but one of gentle, almost therapeutic inquiry. "Woman, why are you weeping?" Her answer came from the depths of her broken heart. It was the same lament she had brought to the disciples, the single, obsessive thought that occupied her entire mind. "They have taken my Lord away," she said, her voice thick with tears, "and I don't know where they have put him." Even in the presence of heavenly beings, her reality was the missing body of her master. She was not looking for a resurrected Lord. She was looking for a corpse to anoint. As she finished speaking, something made her turn around. Perhaps a sound, a shift in the light, and she saw a man standing there in the path. The sun was rising behind him, so he was probably silhouetted, and her eyes were so swollen with tears, she didn't recognize him. She saw a figure in a garden at this early hour. Her mind made the most logical leap it could. He must be the gardener, the man in charge of the grounds. And he spoke to her, echoing the angel's question. "Woman, why are you weeping? Who is it you are looking for?" Her reply was a jumble of assumptions and desperate, practical love. Thinking he was the one responsible, the one who had perhaps moved the body for some official reason, she spoke with a raw and pleading urgency. "Sir," she said, the word dripping with a respect she didn't feel, a desperate attempt to get what she wanted. "If you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Think about that last phrase for a moment. I will get him. I, a small, grieving woman, offering to carry the dead weight of a grown man's body all by herself. It is a statement of such immense, irrational, and powerful love. Her devotion is so great that she believes she can do the impossible. She doesn't ask for help. She just says, "Tell me where he is, and I will take care of it." It is the culmination of her entire discipleship of service. She is, to the very last, a woman of action, a woman whose love must do something. The man in front of her let her desperate plea hang in the morning air for a moment. He let her stand there in her beautiful, heartbreaking, wrong-headed grief. And then he spoke one single word. "Mary." It was not the voice of the gardener. It was not the voice of a stranger. It was the voice. It was the voice that had spoken her name years ago in Magdala and silenced the chaos in her soul. It was the voice she had heard teaching on the hillsides, the voice she had heard laughing with the children, the voice she had heard cry out in agony from the cross. He said her name, and in the sound of that one word, the entire universe was remade. It was not a gradual dawning. It was a lightning strike of recognition. The fog of her grief was burned away in an instant. The tears in her eyes suddenly saw clearly. The man who she thought was the gardener was not the gardener. The man who was dead was not dead. The man who was lost was found. The impossible had happened. He was standing right in front of her, alive. Not a ghost, not a vision, but real, breathing. Here. Her response was as instantaneous and as total as his call. One word exploding from her soul, a word of reverence, of intimacy, of utter shock and joy. "Rabboni," she cried out, "my teacher, my master," and her body followed her voice. She moved toward him, her hands outstretched, an instinctive human gesture to touch him, to hold on, to make sure he was real, to cling to him so that she would never, ever lose him again. It was the physical expression of her overwhelming relief. But he stopped her, his voice gentle but firm. "Do not hold on to me," he said. This was not a rejection. It was a reorientation. It was a way of saying that things were different now, go back to the old days, to the familiar relationship of teacher and student walking the roads of Galilee. His body was different. The world was different. He was on a new trajectory. For I have not yet ascended to the Father. And then he gave her the commission that would change her life and the world forever. He was making her the first evangelist, the first person to ever preach the gospel of the resurrection. Go, he commanded, instead to my brothers, and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. He called the disciples who had abandoned him my brothers, a word of grace and reconciliation. And he called his Father your Father, inviting all of them, through him, into a new and intimate relationship with God. It was a message of incredible density and hope, and he entrusted it not to Peter, not to John, but to Mary, the woman who stayed, the woman who wept, the woman whose love refused to give up. She went. The walk back to the city was not the panicked flight of a few hours earlier. This was a journey of pure, unadulterated joy. She was no longer a mourner, she was a messenger. She was no longer a victim of tragedy. She was the first witness to the ultimate victory. The sun was fully up now, flooding the world with light, and it no longer seemed cruel. It seemed to be celebrating with her. Every bird's song was a hymn of praise. Every flower in the garden was a testament to new life. She had entered the garden to anoint a dead body, and she was leaving it with a message that would conquer death itself. She burst back into that locked room of fear. The disciples were still there, huddled in their grief. They looked up, and they saw her face. It was transformed. The tear stains were still there, but her eyes were shining. The sorrow was gone, replaced by a joy so radiant it was almost terrifying. And she gave them the message. Her sermon was the shortest and most powerful in history. She made the simple, direct, world-altering proclamation, I have seen the Lord. And then she told them everything. She reported the news, faithfully delivering the message he had given to her. She, Mary of Magdala, a woman out of whom 7 demons had been cast, a woman whose testimony would not have been admissible as legal evidence in that society, became the apostle to the apostles. The entire Christian faith, the whole improbable, world-changing story, begins right here. It begins with the voice of one brave, loving, and steadfast woman, telling a group of frightened men in a locked room the best news the world had ever heard. It begins in a garden with a word. Mary. Imagine the scene. A room thick with the smell of fear and stale sorrow. The shutters are closed, the door is barred. The world outside is a threat. Inside, a group of men, the chosen leaders of a failed revolution, are huddled together, speaking in whispers. Their master is dead, executed in the most humiliating way imaginable. Their hope is buried in a borrowed tomb. They are the remnants of a shattered dream. And into this sealed container of despair, the door bursts open, and there is Mary. She isn't weeping anymore. Her face, which they had last seen ravaged by grief at the foot of the cross, is now luminous, transformed by a joy so radical it looks like madness. Her eyes are wild with it. Her breath comes in ragged gasps, not from sorrow, but from having run all the way from the garden. And she says the words, the impossible, unbelievable words, "I have seen the Lord." There is a moment of stunned silence, and then disbelief. It's crucial to understand their reaction. We, who have heard this story our whole lives, can forget how utterly insane her proclamation would have sounded. The Gospels of Mark and Luke are brutally honest about the disciples' response. Luke says her words seemed to them like leros, a Greek word that means nonsense, gibberish, an idle tale, hysterical rambling. Mark says simply, they would not believe it. We must sit with their disbelief for a moment and try to understand it, not just to judge it. First, there was the sheer, impenetrable wall of their grief. Grief is not a window. It is a locked door. It seals you into the reality of your loss. They had just witnessed the most traumatic event of their lives. They had seen the brutal, bloody, undeniable finality of Roman execution. Their minds and hearts were completely saturated with the fact of his death. To them, Mary's story wasn't good news. It was a cruel and nonsensical fiction, perhaps a hallucination brought on by her own overwhelming sorrow. They might have looked at her with pity. Poor Mary, her grief has finally broken her mind. Then there was the simple fact that what she was describing was impossible. People didn't just rise from the dead. Yes, they had seen Jesus raise Lazarus, but that was different. He had called Lazarus out of death. What Mary was describing was someone who had gone into death, conquered it from the inside, and walked out on his own. It was an event of a completely different order of magnitude. It was a claim that the fundamental laws of the universe had been broken. Their minds, steeped in the grim reality of the world, simply could not make room for such a possibility. They had followed a man they hoped was a political messiah, a king who would restore Israel. That hope had been crucified. A resurrected Messiah was not a category they possessed, and we cannot ignore the cultural context. She was a woman. In first century Jewish society, a woman's testimony was not legally valid. In a court of law, her word meant nothing. While these men loved and respected Mary, they were still men of their time. Their dismissal of her story was, in part, an unconscious, ingrained cultural reflex. A story this important, this world-changing, would surely be revealed to the leaders first, to Peter, to John, not to a woman. For God to choose her as the primary, sole witness to the foundational event of human history was a move so radical, so countercultural, that it was, in its own way, as unbelievable as the resurrection itself. It was another sign that this kingdom of God operated on a completely different set of principles than the kingdoms of men. So they dismissed her. They heard the greatest news in human history, and they called it an idle tale. We can almost feel a gentle, cosmic humor in this moment. The men who had been given the keys to the kingdom, who had debated who would sit at the right hand of power, were now locked in a room of their own fear, unable to recognize the truth when it was delivered to them by the one person whose courage and love had not failed. Mary, who had had never asked for a special seat or a position of honor, was the one entrusted with the cornerstone message of the new creation. Her joy was met with their doubt. Her testimony was met with their skepticism. She, the first apostle, had delivered her message to a community that was not yet ready to be the church. She had done what she was told. The rest was not up to her. She had been the witness. Now they would have to become witnesses themselves. And so, later that same day, as evening fell, the disciples were still in that room. The door was still locked. The fear was still thick. Mary was with them, her incredible story hanging in the air, unproven, a point of tension and perhaps even pity. And then it happened. He was just there, not having come through the door, but simply standing among them. The reality of him filled the room. Their first reaction was terror. They thought he was a ghost, a phantom. The dead were supposed to stay dead, and if they didn't, it was a terrifying thing. But he met their fear with a word of peace. "Shalom Aleichem," he said, "peace be with you." The same peace he had given to Mary's tormented mind, he now offered to their terrified hearts. He showed them the evidence. He held out his hands, showing them the wounds where the nails had been. He showed them his side, where the spear had pierced him. This was not a spirit. This was a body, a real, tangible, but transformed body. This was their master, their friend, dead, and now alive. And the gospel says, the disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Their doubt dissolved in the face of his presence. Their fear was washed away by a wave of incredulous joy. And in that moment, Mary was vindicated. Her idle tale was now the undeniable, glorious truth. We can imagine the looks on their faces as they turned to her. The apology, the awe, the dawning realization that she had been right all along. She had been the faithful herald, the true messenger. Her testimony had been the first seed of this new reality. And now, that seed had bloomed in their own hearts. She hadn't needed their belief to make her story true, but their belief now confirmed her role as the chosen first witness. What happened to Mary after this? The pages of the Bible grow quiet about her. She is mentioned one last time by name in the first chapter of the Acts of the Apostles. She is listed with the 11 remaining apostles and the mother of Jesus, gathered in that same upper room, constantly in prayer, waiting for the promised Holy Spirit. She is there at the very beginning of the church, a foundational member of the first Christian community. After that, she disappears from the explicit scriptural record. But her silence in the text does not mean her influence ended. It simply changed. She who had been such an active presence, providing, serving, witnessing, now became a living touchstone for the early church. She was the one who was there. She was the one who had seen him first. Her testimony was not a second-hand report. It was a primary source. We can imagine the gospel writers, years later, seeking her out. John, who stood with her at the cross, would certainly have compared his memories with hers as he composed his deeply personal account. When he wrote with such specific detail about the folded headcloth or the words Jesus spoke to her in the garden, he was almost certainly drawing on the story as he had heard it from her, over and over again. Luke, the careful historian, who tells us he gathered his information from eyewitnesses and servants of the word, must have spoken with her. Her experience, her memory, her very words are woven into the fabric of the Gospels we read today. She is the quiet, authoritative source for the story of the resurrection. Her voice is there, even when her name is not mentioned. Her leadership in the early community would not have been the public preaching leadership of Peter or the theological writing leadership of Paul. Her authority was of a different kind. It was the unshakable moral authority of the first witness. In a room full of debate or doubt, her mere presence would have been enough to recenter the entire community. She was a living reminder of the empty tomb. She was the woman to whom the risen Lord had first appeared and spoken. She did not need a title or an office. Her story was her authority. Over the centuries, however, the clarity of her story became muddied. The vibrant, powerful figure of Mary Magdalene began to be confused and conflated with other women in the Gospels. The most significant of these confusions was with the anonymous, sinful woman in Luke's Gospel, who wept at Jesus' feet and anointed them with perfume, and also with Mary of Bethany, the sister of Lazarus. In a sermon in the year 591, Pope Gregory the Great officially preached this conflated identity, blending these distinct women into a single character, Mary Magdalene, the repentant prostitute. This image took powerful hold of the Western imagination. For centuries, she became the archetypal symbol of female penitence. And while the story of a great sinner who becomes a great saint is a beautiful and powerful one, it is not Mary Magdalene's story. This historical misunderstanding, however well-intentioned, had the unfortunate effect of obscuring her true and far more significant role. It demoted her. It took the focus off her leadership, her financial patronage of Jesus' ministry, her unwavering courage at the cross, and her unique, divinely appointed role as the first witness to the resurrection. It defined her by a sinful past that the Bible never actually gives her, instead of by her incredible faith and loyalty. Gently over time, we have begun to correct this record. We have begun to disentangle the threads and see her once again as the Gospels present her. A woman of stature and courage, a leading disciple, and the primary witness to the central event of the Christian faith. Her real story is more powerful and more radical than the myth that grew up around her. She is not a woman defined by her weakness, but by her strength. She is a testament not just to the power of repentance, but to the power of unwavering devotion. The early church fathers understood her importance. One of them, Hippolytus of Rome, writing in the 3rd century, gave her a title that perfectly captures her unique role. He called her Apostola Apostolorum, the apostle to the apostles. Let's think about that title. An apostle is, quite simply, one who is sent. An apostle is a messenger, an emissary, sent with the authority of the one who sent them. Jesus, in the garden, gave Mary a direct command: go and tell them. He sent her. He made her his messenger, and her mission was to the apostles themselves. They were to be the ones sent out to the whole world, but first, they had to receive the message. And God chose Mary to be the one to deliver it. She is, quite literally, the apostle who was sent to the apostles. It is a title of immense honor and significance, recognizing that her mission was the prerequisite for theirs. Their global mission could not begin until her specific mission to them was complete. Her story was so powerful that it continued to echo and grow even outside the canonical scriptures. In some non-biblical texts from the early Christian centuries, like the Gospel of Mary, she is remembered as a preeminent disciple, the one who had a special, intuitive understanding of Jesus' deepest teachings. These stories show us that for many early Christians, Mary Magdalene was seen as a towering figure of spiritual insight and leadership. Her legacy was one of profound importance. But in the end, as we dim the lights and let this story settle into our hearts, Mary's greatest legacy is not in any title, however grand. It is in the quiet, steadfast nature of her love. Her story is not about grand pronouncements or dramatic miracles. It is a story about the profound power of showing up. She was present. She was present on the dusty roads of Galilee, providing for the needs of the community. She was present in the hostile city of Jerusalem, listening to the teachings. She was present in the shadow of the cross, when the men who had promised to die for Jesus had run away. She was present in the pre-dawn darkness of the garden, determined to perform one last act of love. It was her steadfast presence, her refusal to abandon him even in death, that positioned her to be the first to see him in his new life. Her reward was not a position of power. Her reward was his presence. Her reward was hearing him speak her name. And so, the story of Mary of Magdala comes full circle. It begins with a woman in darkness, a prisoner of 7 demons, a life in chaos. It ends with a woman in a garden at dawn, a messenger of the resurrection, a life given a divine purpose. It is a journey from the deepest imaginable suffering to the highest imaginable joy. Her story reminds us that the people God chooses for the most important tasks are often not the ones the world would choose. They are not the most powerful, or the most eloquent, or the most obviously qualified. They are the ones whose hearts are open, whose love is stubborn, and who are willing to stay when everyone else has gone. They are the ones who are willing to walk through the darkness, carrying their small jar of spices, expecting nothing more than to anoint a body, and who, in doing so, find themselves face to face with the source of all life. It's a story of a love that is stronger than death, and that is a good and peaceful thought to rest on.